Okay, well, great. Well, we're ready to welcome in our today's provocation speaker, Paul LeBlanc. And I will have the honor of introducing Paul, whom I've also had the honor of knowing for about 30 years. It's a great pleasure to welcome Paul to the 2023 Summer Institute on Equity in the Academic Experience, Day 2. I also just want to mention that Paul worked through some challenges to get here in a timely way, and we just want to express our really deep appreciation for Paul's commitment to being here with us and to helping the day be a success. So thank you so much for that, Paul. So let me go ahead and introduce Paul. I'm not sure that there is anyone in any higher education leader and innovator in this century who has done more for equitable higher education at scale than Paul LeBlanc. Since becoming president of Southern New Hampshire University in 2003, under Paul's leadership, the university has grown from 2,800 students to over 160,000 learners and is the largest nonprofit provider of online higher education in the country. In his book, Students First, Equity, Access, and Opportunity in Higher Education, Paul describes how this growth was driven by, quote, the challenge of transforming the lives of those people who are increasingly being left behind in an inequitable economic system where disparities of opportunity are reinforced by hierarchies of race and class. With Paul's leadership, Southern New Hampshire has been at the forefront of combining quality online education and data-driven personalized support. And as we enter a dynamic new period of integrating AI into education, Paul's vision for how the digital and human sides of scaled, equitable education can come together will be more important than ever. Paul immigrated to the United States as a child, was the first person in his extended family to attend college, and is a graduate of Framingham State University, Boston College, and University of Massachusetts. He chairs many boards and commissions, has served as senior policy advisor to Undersecretary Ted Mitchell at the U.S. Department of Education, and in 2018 won the prestigious TIAA Institute Hesburgh Award for Leadership and Excellence in Higher Education, joining some of the most respected university and college presidents in American higher education. Paul has become an exemplar of equity-minded innovation that is both fearless and values-driven. We're honored that he's here joining us today to share his vision and experience. Welcome, Paul.
Randy, thank you so much. That's such a lovely introduction. I feel like I'm going to sign you up for my eulogy someday. You just have to outlive me. Just make that promise for me. But thank you. It's lovely. Randy knows it's been a bit of a crazy morning, and which ended with me at a doctor finding out that I have a pinched nerve in my neck. So I am only in moderate pain right now, and hopefully you won't feel the same at the end of my comments. I hope that I don't cause you any moderate pain. So you mentioned, Randy, my writing of Students First, which I wrote in the first year of the pandemic in 2021, and it's an argument for system change. And really, the revelation for me, and it will not be a revelation to you because you've no doubt thought about this all, but is the degree to which a system built on time, namely the credit hour, an artifact not designed to do what we do with it. As you know, Amy Lightnin's very famous article on the credit hour, Cracking the Credit Hour, talks about how it was created by Carnegie to pay pensions to retired faculty, has been used as a basis for everything we do in higher ed. It's how we unitize knowledge. It's how we apportion faculty workload. It's how we measure student progress to the completion of a degree. It's how we apportion our faculty's classroom spaces. And most importantly, it's the basis for giving out over $150 billion a year of federal financial aid, which is the lifeblood of our industry. Here's the problem. Poor people don't have as much time, and they don't have as much control over time. So if you work in huge swaths of the American economy, retail, hospitality, sometimes manufacturing, small business, which is still a bigger part of our economy than people sometimes recognize, you may not even know what your schedule is next week. Yet when we tie you to a class that meets on Wednesdays at 4 o'clock, let's say, there's very little room for lives that are often easily disrupted, right, with less social capital. So let me just give you a couple of examples of how this plays out. If you think about the fact that the average student completing a 2-year degree in an American community college loses, on average, 43% of their credits when they transfer to a 4-year school. Who goes to community colleges? Think about the inequities that are built into that. So we force low-income learners to take more time, repeat more credits, spend more money in order to complete their degree. And we do this because we have a time-based system that doesn't really give us very much insight into what people actually learn, which invites the kind of thing we see with transfer credit and all its inefficiencies. Things like, oh, that intro to psych class can't be as good at that community college as my intro to psych class, so I'm not signing off on that. You can have it as an elective, but we're going to make you take ours if it's a requisite for your program. Think about SAP, satisfactory academic progress. This is a measure, again, a time-based measure of federal financial aid. So one of the people that I opened my book at the description of a young woman whom I met who had attended 2 community colleges, and this is not a critique of community colleges, it's a critique of the credit hour, but she came from the poorest neighborhood in Boston, single mom, very, very little social capital or resources. And her transcripts were littered with F's and W's. And I asked her about this, and she explained that her 7-year-old daughter, 7-year-old at the time, had chronic respiratory illness. So every time a little girl got sick, she would miss 7, maybe more days of class, fall behind, not be able to sort of catch up, not do well on the exam. If it was early enough in the term, she would take the W. If it was too late, she would take the F. It felt like this was not on paper a student who was ready to do college work. But when we put her in a non-time-based, competency-based program, where she could hit the pause button anytime she needed to. And she described it that way. She said, I'm the schedule. She didn't say I set the schedule. She said, I'm the schedule, I'm the calendar. She could just hit the pause with no penalty. She could increase or decrease the number of competencies she was working on. And none of this impacted satisfaction. We didn't have to use a time-based measure. And then she could resume when she was ready, when her little girl was okay and back in class. And she raced to the completion of her degree. She was really smart, and she's almost finished her bachelor's degree. And she'll do that in record time, but time that she's controlled and in which she has agency. We didn't have a student who wasn't ready for higher ed. We had a higher ed system that wasn't ready to serve a low-income student, and based on sort of structural and equitable models. In the middle of writing students first, I'm going fast so that I can sort of get my piece out and then have conversation with you. In the middle of writing students first, I really got blocked. And I'm usually a pretty fast writer, but I got stuck. And I got stuck because I was coming back to this question that I kept sort of plaguing me, which is, I know I'm arguing for these system changes, but there's a different dimension that I sort of wanted to explore. And the question I asked my wife is, do you think higher ed can learn to love its students again? And she jokingly said, did it ever? And I said, I felt like my undergraduate experience, I felt loved. If love means people who really knew me, who took the time to understand me, who mentored me, who spent their sort of resources on me, who I felt were lifting my sights, sort of giving me the space to dream bigger dreams for myself. So yeah, I felt loved. And I don't know if higher ed today, with all of its pressures and how we sort of think about our industry, still does that. And I mentioned this to a friend who was one of my readers for the first book, and he said, why don't you just write the answer? Like, get it out of the way, write the answer. So I started writing, and I didn't stop writing for almost a month. I wrote furiously all day, Saturday, all day, Sunday. I'd work through lunch, and it wasn't exhausting. It was the kind of writing, and Randy knows this, that makes you like, you can't wait to get back to your keyboard at the end of the day. Like, I'd get up at 4 and start writing again. And it became the draft for my second book, which is called Broken. And the subtitle of that book is How Our Systems of Care Are Failing Us and How We Can Fix Them. And it took me from thinking about the kind of system inequities to a different kind of inequity that's almost more existential. And what the book argues is that we can't effectively transform lives without being in deep relationship with people. That the first chapter is on mattering. I'm using the term from Greg Elliott, the sociologist at Brown, who talks about mattering as really feeling like you are seen and known, that you are invested in, and that you actually have shaping power on the organization which sees you, that you can sort of shape what it looks like. And then the sort of second chapter is about aspiration, the comment I meant earlier about, can we lift people's sights? Can we lift them up? And I was struck as I started thinking about these questions in higher ed, how many scaled systems of care, so healthcare, K-12, mental health, criminal justice, could argue they don't even pretend to be a system of care any longer, but addiction treatment, how many of these systems of care routinely dehumanize the very people they're supposed to lift up? And I think higher ed does that way more than we'd like to admit or recognize. So I ended up spending a lot of time with innovators in those industries who are really rethinking their work. And I also spent time with people like, psychologist Jessica Benjamin at NYU and Matt Steinfeld at Yale and Greg Elliott, who I mentioned, just trying to understand the psychology of all this. And all of them would argue, Jessica uses this notion of thirdness. We have to work with students. We're going to transform their lives. We talk about transforming lives at scale. You have to be in relationship with them. They have to feel like they matter. You have to be able to look, you have to collect their stories. Like, do you really know their stories? Do you understand what's sort of getting in the way of their success? And there's no shortchanging time if you're going to do that work. All of these innovators move towards coaching models. And that's what we use at SNHU. Like our secret sauce is our advising model. It's not our faculty model or our academic program. Those are very important, but it's our advising model because that advisor stays with you along the whole of your journey. They know you intimately. They know when you're struggling. If you have been, now let's think about this in terms of equity. If you've been through schooling all your life where the only message you can take from it is, I don't matter very much, and where so few people in your world help you dream bigger dreams for yourself. If they don't collect your stories, if they don't know you in the complexity of who you are as a being, I'm not talking about the low level of insight we get. We collect data like crazy, but in the end, it's not the kind of insight I'm talking about. That only happens with our advisors who are in deep relationship with our learners. It's only then that you can start to really change the system and have profound transformational impact on people. And to do that, you have to redesign systems. And here's the last thing, and I'll stop, Randy. I think so much of how we have talked about this work of scale systems of care, have what they do is they sort of use a very sort of capitalist industrial models. You have replicable processes, you put things in databases, CRMs, they're very defined fields, SISs, very defined fields. You put people into these little boxes. And what you try to do when you do that is find efficiency and scale and cost savings. And systems built that way tend to want to minimize the amount of human contact, the amount of human relationship happens, because that's messy, it's hard to measure, it's more expensive, et cetera. These innovators that I'm talking about flip the switch. So what they say is, I have to understand the most important human relationships in the work we do. I need to hold that space sacred. And then I have to use technology to scale the hell out of everything else. That's where I make my model work from a business perspective, but with much better results for the people I treat. So I'll just finish with one example of this. Medical One, it's now a different name, was an amazing healthcare system, multi-state healthcare system. CEO is a guy named Xander Packard. I spent a lot of time with Xander interviewing him about this. They go to a coaching model of healthcare. You get a healthcare coach. They actually do the counterintuitive thing, which is they absolutely minimize your time with the clinician. Doctors are expensive, and they're not actually as good about the things that are really transforming for the patients. So the clinicians get very little time, but your healthcare coach is with you in the examination room, either by video or directly, and they're listening. So when the doctor says, hey, Randy, we need to get you on a low sodium diet, they spend an hour with you afterwards talking about what that means. And Randy says, I guess I don't use a salt shaker. She's like, well, let's talk about your shopping. Let's talk about the amount of processed food. There's an enormous amount of salt in those things, right? And then let's talk about who does the shopping for you. Oh, it's your niece. Can we get her on the phone? Let me run off some shopping lists for low sodium diets, right? And they have amazing, amazing results. And by the way, if you think that model doesn't scale, Amazon has acquired them. Amazon doesn't do anything without an intent to scale. Now let's see if they can hold true to these very human principles. So I'm going to finish there and say, I think higher education, if higher education is going to learn to love its students again, we have to rethink the work we do if we're going to do it at the kind of scale that I'm interested in. Because we are leaving far too many people behind, and the system we have today, I would argue, isn't really about students in many, many instances. Full of people who have a calling to work with students, but not systems that give them the space and the time to do it. Our advising ratios at SNHU are now down to, we keep reducing them because we're finding so many more challenges around mental health and other things. So we're down to about 170 students to an advisor. We have community colleges in California right now that are 1,600 to 1. There's no relationship at work there. And I do, like, I'm not a fan of Hillbilly Elegy, if you've read that book. I'm actually quite a critic of it. But there's one aspect of that book that I really love. It's the role of the grandmother, because she was the relationship, if you remember the book, if you read it, she was the person who believed in him, who believed he could live in a better world than the one he was in. And one of the people I spent time with was Matt Beal, who's one of your colleagues, Randy. He's the head of child and adolescent psychology at Georgetown. I said, Matt, tell me about resiliency. Like, why do some people make it out? What happens? And he said, there are 3 things that have to be present. There's a lot of complexity, but if there are 3 things at the heart of it, they have to have some passion you can ignite, that you can hook into. They have to have some sense that there's a better world. And this is that sort of notion of giving them better dreams to dream. Ideally, they've had a year of normal. They had a year when they weren't homeless. They had a year when they remember, like, being in a house, for example. If they're not that, you have to at least give them a vision of that. But the third and most important thing, they have to have just one person who believes in them and believes that they can accomplish great things in their life, that they can transform their life. And that's the model that we're trying to build around. I think it's the critical piece. If you know, I keep saying the final note, but I just get like I could talk about this all day. But if you know Donna Beadle's work around extreme poverty, she has a great quote, and I will finish with this. She says, no one who's escaped extreme poverty ever cites the design of a program, system, a policy, or an organization. You know what they always cite? They cite a person. They cite one person who took that level of interest and believed in them. And that's the system we're trying to build at scale. I'll stop.
Thank you, Paul. That was fantastic, and you opened up so many doors there. And let me just also very much encourage people to drop into the chat. We have one from Pittsburgh, which we'll come to in a moment. I wondered if I could just ask one question before we dive into that. I've many questions I'd like to ask, but also encourage folks in the group to chime in. I want to just go back to when you said that do you think that higher education can learn to love its students again? And which I think is a really powerful thing to wonder about. You say several times in Students First, where you acknowledge that even though you were first gen and immigrated, et cetera, that you still recognize that you were white, and you may have had opportunities that were because you were white and whatnot. So I guess just to ask you, because I know you're reflective about this, about do you think that higher ed once loved all of its students, or that the love was a kind of mutuality around a certain, kind of narrower range, and that there is something new here about learning to love a much wider range of students, the full range of students? So.
I think you nailed it. I mean, what I try to acknowledge in that book is I might have been poor and first gen, but I was male and white. And that was an industry in a time that was pretty friendly and accommodating. And now I think we live in a time, which of course, no revelation here, we're seeing this sort of country rent apart between those who would say, no, we need to be much more embracing and expansive. And a time when, the Supreme Court may very well outlaw affirmative action, and we've got governors actively persecuting the higher ed institutions in their states around things like inclusivity and diversity. So it's always been hard. I think it's why HBCUs have been such a powerful counter story, because that is a place that I think loved its students because they know their stories. They invited their stories and invited them to be their whole selves. I think that's become harder. We're at least in a fraught time where the country and our industry feels very split. I sit on the board of the American Council of Education, and we had a meeting with presidents from Florida and Texas, and they're begging AC not to take a public stance. They said, that's the fight that our governors want to, that's the fight they want to pick. They want enemies on wokeness, and let us sort of do what we need to do in the ways we need to do it. And I think they're doing it in some cases rather stealthy in with a lot of ingenuity, but it shouldn't be this hard. So I'm glad you raised the question, Randy.
Yeah, thank you. University of Pittsburgh lobbed in a question that I wanted to expand on too. So let me just read in that. It says, you mentioned your advising model being at the heart of what you do. Can you talk about how you scaled that and how did you get buy-in? And I have a couple of questions around, your arc of change, but this is a great entree to that. Did your advising models get smaller over the years or ratios get smaller over the years because you realized how critical that was? Was that a bit of a journey for you to get to your current advising ratios?
Yeah, I think we always built on the assumption that advising was our core. So if you look at our model, and there's lots of room to critique it, we have we have a heavy reliance on adjunct faculty. And our academic program is a standardized program inspired by the Open University of England. They did this back in the 60s. So faculty aren't creating their courses. They're not building their curriculum. They have very little latitude on the assignments. In fact, they have none. They can add some things, but they have to stay with the assessments that have been built in by assessment experts. There are rubrics that are built in. All of that with an eye towards getting sort of uniform quality. And if I were being a critic of what we do, I would say, but when you don't allow for that brilliant faculty member to do their thing, you lose that. But I'm working at scale, so I can't pay the price of that. There's a heavy, heavy price for the occasionally brilliant, as opposed to really knowing that I have pretty good optics into the quality of the academic program. And what we build is sort of like a Honda Accord. It is well engineered, it's respectable, it gets the job done academically, it serves students well, and it's a good value. But it's our and as you go from course to course, you're going from faculty member to faculty member. Remember, this isn't a residential institutional where I'm an English major and I kind of know all my faculty over time and I get to be part of that community. We're 185,000 students now, and there isn't that experience. So students go from course to course. So what they need is that person who's with them for the whole of the journey. And those advisors are very much trained in how to work with those students. Their job is 10 to 15% academic, and it's 85% personal coaching. It's life coaching. It's about knowing who's having a rough patch in their marriage, about whose kids are giving them a run for their money, who needs help with grocery money. Our students are, I say all the time, we serve those people who are $400 away, an unexpected car repair or medical bill, $400 from dropping out. So it's the $5 million we just set aside for emergency aid. And we make it very, very easy for advisors to help students. That we always have a sort of always do the right thing. They don't have to ask permission. Somebody's computer is breaking down, they're going to be late for an assignment, they have to videotape something for, Sunday. Every Sunday, all assignments are due. It's a very regimented academic program. A lot of people wouldn't want to teach for us for that reason, I think. A lot of people love teaching for us, but if that's happening, that advisor has permission to go grab a Chromebook, put it in a FedEx box, ship it out, and tell the student, hey, you're all set. Tomorrow there'll be a Chromebook on your doorstep. Like, let's keep you on track. If it's grocery money, we had $100 million of CARES Act money to disperse for emergency student aid. 65% of our requests were for food insecurity. That's who we serve. So for us, it's about, I go back to Donna Beadle, it's like, we have to give them the person who's with them through the whole of their journey. And the most emotional moments at graduation, we do many of them because we're big. We just had 4 of them over 2 days. Ours when advisors and students meet each other for the first time, face to face. They've known each other intimately, but now they're face to face. And I get weekly messages from students saying, just need you to know, Heidi, my advisor, when I thought I couldn't do it, when everything was falling apart in my life, blah, blah, blah. Heidi was my cheerleader. She's the one that convinced me I could hang in it. I would not be graduating if it wasn't for Heidi. She's my hero. Like, that is a common message. To look at the research around this, I will quote Dan Greenstein, who's now the head of the PASHE system in Pennsylvania, but who was at Gates and headed higher ed. I remember asking Dan when I was interviewing him at a conference, I said, Dan, you know, Gates has put a ton of money into so many things. What's the one thing that you learned that feels like it's a difference maker? And he said, if I can make one suggestion, it would be professionalize your advising ranks. Like move advising into the world of professional advisors who are hired for it, trained for it, who embrace it, and who understand that that role is relational. And look at COVID's taken a heavy toll. You know, Randy, when you asked about, you know, decreasing the number of advisees, honestly, that came out of George Floyd and the pandemic, those two things. So our advisors were all of a sudden getting things dumped in their lap that they just weren't prepared for. We rolled out trauma-informed counseling practices across the hundreds of advisors we have. We felt like they just needed more breathing space because this was a heavy burden. And that's what really led us to bring down. The other thing we're seeing is because we're such a large partner to Walmart and Amazon and other large scale employers, we're seeing a real bang in persistence. So our highest risk students are students who have never been to college before. They don't have a sense of what it takes. They have no experience of doing the work. And now you've got all these frontline workers who didn't have that opportunity who are enrolling. So it used to be that 80% of our students had credits from other colleges, typically more than one. Today, that's down to almost 60%. And they are more challenging. They're higher risk of attrition. So that's the other reason we've lowered our ratios, to give those students much more time and hand-holding. Once they get their feet under them, they're fine. But that takes 5, 6, 7, 8 terms before they feel fully confident. And then they need less from their advisor quite often. Then they go to a sort, no, I'm good. Just am I in the right course? Thanks so much for checking in. No, everything's great. So yeah, and all of this, by the way, undergirded by a very powerful CRM and a ton of data analytics. We have 70 people on our data analytics team. We're measuring everything for these students, right from our first interaction with them. I can tell you today, I could go onto a dashboard and tell you that if somebody clicks on SNHU banner ad online, typically they get a call back within 3 minutes. I can tell you how long it takes them to complete a FAFSA, how long it takes to complete an application, and then all the way into their classes. We monitor every section 24/7. We know when people haven't been in. We know when instructors not answering questions. It feels a little big brotherish. We try not to sort of put that in front of people. But if we see a student who our predictive analytics says should be performing here, and all of a sudden we see them performing down here, we're not waiting. It's a very proactive advising model. That's a phone call that says, hey, Randy, how's it going in that stats class? It looks like it's giving you a run for your money. I might not say, hey, check, and I saw that your exam grade last night was a D. But I'd say, it looks like it's giving you a run for your money. And you say, oh my God, what was I thinking? This is crazy. And that allows me to say, let me get you some extra help. We got some great tutors for stats, blah, 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 blah. You might say, oh no, I had a really shitty week. Like everything went to hell. I'll get back on track. I already talked to the professor. He's going to let me do a makeup, blah, blah, blah. Oh, great, you're good. Or you could say, what was I thinking? Like, why am I doing this? I'm still so far away from the finish line and it's hard and I'm so busy. Those are those interventions in that moment where that conversation can save that student, kind of talking you back from the brink. So we need very, very powerful insights, and we're not nearly as good at it still as we need to be.
Thank you. Let me just probe a little bit more on that. And there's some new things coming into the chat, which I'll call out. This is a question from Heidi that says, thank you, Paul. I'm interested in who you think the one person can be. I know you've been talking about your advisors, so maybe that's the beginning of the answer, but faculty, staff, peer mentors, is it just the one advisor or could it be a wider range? What do we know about the values of these different groups as advisors? And here thinking about things like the long-time findings from the Gallup-Purdue poll about an adult that cares about your hopes and dreams and things like that. So I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit more, and maybe I can connect it to your comment about minimizing the time that patients spend with clinicians, and in a more traditional institution, what would that mean in terms of that model? So
yeah, so I think in more traditional institutions that look different than us, it could quite often, might even most often be a faculty member, if that faculty member is working in a system that gives them the reward structure that allows them to spend and invest their time in students in the ways that can really make a difference. My most powerful influences outside my parents were faculty. but I went to what was called the State Normal School. It wasn't called that anymore, but Framingham State College at the time inhabited that space between community colleges and the four-year research universities, and it was for working class kids. And I'm still in touch with faculty I had. They're quite elderly because I'm not any younger, but we're still friends because they changed my whole life, and they're the people I cite. But I think for athletes, and quite often be a coach, it's quite likely to be a coach. I think sometimes it can be a work study supervisor. In our model, we're built for the advisor because our students aren't wandering a campus. They're entering a portal. So we have to have that one reliable person who's always checking on them. Now, we have some great faculty who will also support that and forge relationship. But again, students every 8 weeks, they're going to another class, another professor. So so I think to your answer, your question, it can be anybody. And I think in lots of models, it should be the faculty, but I have a daughter who is, early in her career in higher education, I won't say where, and her husband both. And she's a great teacher and she just loves working with students. And I have to have this sort of gentle conversation that says, great, but also remember your sort of tenure and promotion and what's being required, because the incentive systems aren't built. The incentive systems in so many universities are really not about students. They're about scholarship and research and service on committees and a whole bunch of other things. Can I share, do we have time, Randy, for me to share the story of Loris Barretz, who's one of my favorite stories in the book? I'll do it really quick. So Loris was the CEO of the University of Utah healthcare system. Ruth Watkins, who then was the president, was the one that said, you really got to talk to him when she heard about this book. And he's amazing. He's retired now. Thank you. He's retired now, but he at the time, his wife had an unexpected, University of Utah Healthcare is the largest healthcare system in the state. And his wife had an unexpected attack of kidney stones, and he rushed her to an emergency room. Apparently, kidney stones are one of the most painful things you can experience. He was appalled by the dehumanizing treatment that she received. So much so that I interviewed him as he described. So, wait a minute, Lawrence, did they know who she was? He goes, yeah, I'm the CEO. I'm in the room. And he goes, I was thinking to myself, what about some poor schmuck off the street? And what he was struck by was like, just the curtness, the little bit amount of time, the kind of rushing to the thing, the nurse who's looking at a screen and entering data and not actually looking at his wife and not asking the clinician, right? Like it was all very transactional. And to his great credit, he didn't blame the people on duty that day. He blamed himself. He said, wait a minute, this is my hospital. Like I have to own this. So he did a really, I describe it in the book. He went to the department that collects patient feedback. And he said, I want to see the actual letters and surveys. He gets aggregated data. So he gets averages, and averages obscure the worst, right? They bring on the best, but they obscure the worst. So he read through over a weekend, he read through boxes of these things, letters and the open sections on surveys. And then he didn't tell anybody he's going to do this. It's a great story. He paid someone, a firm, to go out and talk to and interview all of those who would be willing to share their stories and videotape them, high production quality. And then he brought all his clinicians into an auditorium and closed the door, turned on the lights and played the video. He said people were crying. And they kept saying, this isn't us. And he's like, no, this is us. We did this. What you're hearing is he even was tearing up as he was telling me this story. We did this. And then he set out over the next 5 years to change the way that hospital thinks about its patients. And every innovator I talk to says you have to change the reward structure. You have to follow the money. Like what gets paid for, what doesn't get paid for, what gets rewarded, what doesn't get rewarded. So he started, building bonus programs around the time you spent with patients and the kind of feedback you were getting from your patients, et cetera. A whole bunch of things he did. I don't want to skirt over it, but we're tight for time, but I want to get to the main point. So he took the University of Utah healthcare system from the bottom 20th percentile in terms of patient happiness and satisfaction to quite literally the #1 healthcare system in the country in 5 years. Remarkable trajectory. And when I asked him, I said, Lawrence, you described all of these things you did. What was at the heart of it? Like if you could what was at the heart of this? And he said, you know what? People just wanted their caretakers to know them as human beings. They just wanted to be seen. And I have a chapter in the book about stories. And I think CEOs and presidents and chancellors are the chief storytellers in chief of their institutions. I do that all the time. I go out and I tell the story. But I think what Laura sort of taught me is that we have to be courageous enough to collect the stories that run counter to our narrative. So don't just talk about your graduates. Go out and talk to the ones who didn't finish with you. Find out what happened. Talk to the ones who struggled and find out where your institution let them down. Look at, these are students who often have really hard lives. There's probably a limit to what we can do to keep a student, but I'm not sure that we go as far as we can or need to in instances. So um, it was very powerful talking to Lawrence, because I think he's sort of an amazing leader who really just changed his world. And by the way, you know the research, right? When people know their physician and feel like their physician knows them, even when they commit malpractice, they are far less likely to sue them for malpractice. Right? It's like, oh no, Dr. Bass, like I've had him for years. Yeah, I know, but he's a good, like he came to me and I understand sometimes things happen. Like it's remarkable. And why? Because I have a relationship with you. And those inequities persist, of course, right? So again, communities of color, low-income people, what kind of healthcare do we give them access to today? Randy knows I sort of woke up and I started my day in New York with this pinched nerve thing. I have a concierge, I have privilege, so I have a concierge medical practice. I emailed my doctor at 5:30, at 6, he said, come see me as soon as you get off the plane. That's privilege incarnate. I'm not proud of it, but we're lucky enough to be able to have access to that service. So the sort of inequity that runs throughout, and it's deepest, I think, where communities of color are most fully implicated. If you take a look at the war on drugs, what we did to Black communities, especially in the US, and then take a look at what's happened in our criminal justice system. I think it will be a shameful period as the history is told.
Mm-hmm. Well, and thank you for that and all that, and the story about the CEO and whatnot. I think that and I'm trying to catch up to a lot of chat traffic here. So let me let me first by just because I want to try to be true to the chat stream. Miriam, first of all, just thank you for acknowledging the historical model and mission of caring from student ingrained for the student ingrained into HBCU. So you just got a shout out for acknowledging that. So I just want to call that out. Just a very quick question, and then that'll lead into what I think I'll try to cluster several comments together in the next question. But one of the questions was, what's the role of full-time tenure line faculty in this model? And so you might just briefly explain what your faculty model is. And then I want to come back to a bunch of comments that are really about the relationship between incentives and systems and care. So, but first, just
so we have very, very few. We have no tenure. We have rolling contracts, and we have very few full-time faculty. So those 185,000 students are being overwhelmingly served by adjunct faculty. And I sort of lose sleep over this a little bit. I have to always say, and it's a sort of, if you have to explain it this much, it's probably too complicated. But when we hire somebody to teach for us, it's a pretty minimal role. Remember, we wouldn't know this. We're fiercely asynchronous. Remember what I said about time as a source of inequity? We are not tying our students to being online at a certain time. So the result of that is faculty never lecture. There's no classroom delivery. There's no knowledge delivery. It's all built into the course itself. Faculty are really there to do a couple of things. So, and it's a pretty minimal load, if you will. I don't want to minimize the importance, but it is to orchestrate the discussions. I think they are of questionable learning value, but at least bring students into a forum. They're there, more importantly, to discern when students are struggling or stuck and to unlock their learning. That's the single most important thing they do. And they do assessments based on rubrics and pre-created assessments generally, and then the rubrics that are embedded in them. What we were seeing was a great variability in our grading. And when we introduced rubrics, we sort of standardized and narrowed that band. I think with AI, we'll probably take assessment off the plate as well pretty soon. So it would be really a kind of learning coach, like almost academic coaching. You're stuck in your learning. Let me walk you through and talk about what's going on here. So we are revisiting the faculty model. Our students, interestingly, post-COVID, they never asked for it before, but they want some synchronous options. They don't want to be tied to synchronous class times, but they ask us like, why can't I just get on with my faculty member on video? Because I've had 2 years of Zooming with grandma, right? So there's like new expectations about how communications will take place. Interestingly, we have seen massive growth in a profile of student we never served before, 17 to 22-year-olds. We have 30,000 of them now. That was never our student profile. If you had asked me this question 4 years ago, I would have said 30-year-old, 2 kids, stuck in a dead-end job, has credits, needs to complete so they can unlock an economic opportunity. And the 4 drivers for our students have always been, and the 4 C's, we've talked about it forever. They need to be convenient. So that's why online exploded, because it fits better in their busy lives. They needed to be, they need us to address costs. So we really work hard to keep our costs down. They needed to be the right credential, the 3rd C, which is, will this in fact unlock an opportunity for me? And then the last one is completion time. They feel urgency. Like, I'm stuck and I am stuck. Like, how fast? So how transfer credit friendly are your policies? Do you have the ability to do course planning on the fly that says, hey, Heidi, I know you said you wanted to be an X, but if you do a Y, I can show you that your earnings are actually going to be 5% higher on completion. There are more jobs in Y, and I can get you there faster because more of your credits will count towards program completion. And Heidi often will say, A, works for me, like not even a question about the difference. Sometimes they'll say, oh, I didn't even know about Y. It's kind of remarkable the degree to which students they know the jobs that they know. So we often are in that conversation. All of that, by the way, is another area that we are moving quickly to deploy AI. Course planning takes our advisors far too much time because it's literally a manual kind of working through, and you have to have a lot of knowledge that you've consumed and hold.
Thank you. Let me just see if I can sneak in a couple of different questions together here. We're now looking at about 8 or 9 minutes left. There's a number of questions in the chat that were all around the problem of incentives. The kind of care model you're talking about is often would not be practical, for example, in R1 with loads on faculty. I think that there's also was a reference to the people who are providing that care themselves need care. And I think one of the things that we find a lot in the population here at this Equity Institute is the feeling of a lot of frontline staff who feel like the burden of trying to deliver student-centered care often falls disproportionately on them without a lot of care for their own well-being. So I wonder just in general, if you can, I'll see if I can make this a 2-part questions just for efficiency. One, if you can talk about how you think about the well-being of your advisors and their ability to do their work with care, but also so many of our people here at this institute are trying to retrofit their universities to be kinds of institutions of care and love and time and space. And when you're out interacting with other presidents from more traditional universities, how do you see them responding to your model, to thinking, is there any thought that we need to recapitalize to shift some of our resources into advising and care in a way, say, from instruction? Is that kind of thinking even happening? So well-being of your staff and the idea of retrofitting for a more care-based or relationship-based model.
One of the things that I spent when I did the research for my book, I would talk to people in criminal justice and healthcare and K-12. Almost every one of them came to those industries because they had some sense of calling. And that sense of calling had to do with making people's lives better, right? Like doctors who would say to me, I came to take care of patients. What I do now is fill out insurance forms online. And I get paid more if I see more patients. There's this constant pressure from hospital leaders to see more patients. If you go into K-12, where I did a book talk in London recently, and the journalist in London who was interviewing me said, look at, you're saying that our teachers in the K-12 system have to know their students. You say they need to collect their stories and really make them feel like they matter. You actually go ahead and said our teachers need to love their students. Say, yep, I know, that's what I argued. And she said, so if I talk to my teachers, here's what they'll tell you. Their class sizes have ballooned. They've lost their teacher. They don't use teacher aides, use a different expression in English, but they've lost their teacher aides. They have to submit their lesson plans. They have to sit on this committee. They don't call it lunch duty, they call it something else, but they have what we would call lunch duty. And what they would say to you, if you made this case to them, is there's no time for me to know my students. There's no time for me to do, I'm burnt out, I'm tired. This is not what I came for. And as you know, 50% of students, 50% of graduates of schools of education leave the profession within 5 years. I mean, that is a disaster by any account. My point in all of that is that we put people to take, in systems of care to take care of human beings, and then we don't support them, we don't give them the resources they need, and we don't take good care of them. And if it's true that hurt people hurt others, people who are well cared for care for others. So we put a lot of store in how we take care of our folks. So it's training, right? That's sort of trauma-informed counseling practices, for example. It is a really incredible sense of mission. There are lots of things that you could criticize SNHU for, but no one who's ever visited has walked away without saying, it's the most mission-focused, most mission-driven place I've ever visited. So there's a great, and that just people it energizes people. But we also have to take good care of, Maslow's hierarchy, right? So I'm very proud of the fact that we are the only university in the United States to be on the Chronicle's Best Colleges to Work For list every year since its inception. We're the only university to be on the honor roll for that listing or that evaluation every year since the honor roll was created. And during the pandemic, and still, that has meant things like we sent quarterly stipends to all of our folks. Like, hey, we know you're incurring expenses, you're working remotely now. And we didn't say you have to use it for work. We said, you might have kids at home, like go out and buy board games and art supplies if that's what gives you more breathing space and mental health space. We have certainly rolled out lots of supports that we didn't have before. ERGs have been critical. So people want not only to be cared for, remember what I said about mattering and Greg Elliott, they have to feel like they have an influential voice on the organization for which they work. If you only make them feel like they matter, hey, Randy, it's great to see you. It's great to see you back in the office. And if you only invest in them, here's your 1,000 or your 2,000 or 3,000 of professional development money this year. Have a great time. Go learn some things. If you only do those two, it's not enough. That's sort of like good employee relations. That's when I say, Randy, you've been working on this thing for a long time for us. How can we be better? Like, you must have some ideas about that. So we've been experimenting, for example, with communities of practice. And I can give you a very quick example of that because it gives people enormous agency. We, after George Floyd was murdered, I asked the board, I told the board we're going to set aside $5 million. And we wanted to devote those resources to answering three questions. In the immediate aftermath, what do our people need? Our people and our students, what do they need right now? Second thing was longer term, what does it mean to be a student of color at SNHU? What does it mean to be a staff member, a faculty member of color at SNHU? And then the third one was, how can we sort of expand our sense of inclusivity? Because LGBTQ students, for example, were coming under increasing attacks. So what we would have done in the past is I would have turned to our chief diversity officer and said, Jada, like, let's bring in a consultant. Let's think about this. Let's announce our 3 big initiatives, $5 million. And you know what? The place would have stood up and applauded. They would have said, great for leadership, proactive. We didn't have to ask you, you're doing this up. It's really great. But we did something different and we're learning to be less top down. What we said is we want 3 communities of practice, one for each of those questions. We know from the research that community practice shouldn't be more than about 20 people. They need to be well facilitated. We'll train the facilitators. We brought people in and trained the facilitators. And the only 2 criteria for being appointed is you had to have a demonstrated passion for the work. So everyone who knows you says, oh my God, Heidi, she thinks about this all the time. And you had to have track record. It wasn't enough that you were, saying all the right things, but have you done anything? It could be, by the way, just volunteering your local, small agency, social service agency, but have you actually done it? Have you got in the trenches and get your hands dirty? And the result of that is our 3 communities of practice, you didn't get on by title or position or authority. And they were messy at first because they always are, and scheduling is a bear and blah, blah. but then they found their way. And it took longer to get the recommendations from them. But the only answer I could give to those recommendations were, yep, of course. And they were better than we would have done if we had stayed top down. And they were more fully owned and embraced by the people. And all of them described feeling like I really matter this place, like that you respected my role and opinion. It doesn't matter that I'm, an executive assistant 6 levels down in the organization. I was invited to be part of this, and it matters to me because I have a passion for this work. And interestingly, even after those recommendations were then rolled out, those groups continue to meet. They had nothing to do. Let's continue to meet. And in that comes community and relationship and connection. And those are tools of resiliency in a world where we have never been more connected and never more lonely. Right? And you see this in the mental health crisis. So it's no silver bullet. Like taking good care of your people is like having really good ear to the ground and just building more infrastructure to support folks and to hear their stories and then to give them agency, I think is really critical. The Great Resignation is not, as it turns out, about salary as much as it is about agency and growth.
Yeah, and care, feeling like
care.
you're cared for.
And for all that, sadly, we had one of our advisors die by suicide last week. It's not the first one since the pandemic started. And this is someone who I knew, and there was just no, when these situations happen, you rack your brains. What did I miss? What signal should I have seen? And there's nothing that any of us can think. Right? And we just don't know the heavy toll. There's so much suffering right now, the heavy toll that people are taking. We should not end on that note, by the way. But yeah, I love the question.
Can I ask you, and then we'll end here because we're at time, but there was one question that I bet you can answer in like 30 seconds. And that is the question about what evidence do you have for Southern New Hampshire providing financial opportunities for your graduates? Can you give us 1 or 2 data points in 30 seconds to answer the outcomes question?
So we try to square 2 things. We try to square what the average starting earnings are for positions or fields where we're graduating students by region, because it differs greatly. So that gives us a sense of, are there jobs and what do they typically pay? And then we do surveys of student data, because as you know, we can't, the Department of Ed and the IRS still can't link up their data on this question. So I don't love the fact that we do that. And I was talking to Scott Pulsford at WGU, and they're doing Equifax data. So we're looking at trying to get more insight into that question. Where we found ours, and the third thing we look at is average debt. So for example, we had a culinary program, and students love that program. They're passionate. Like someone who chooses to be in that program, often they grew up in a restaurant industry, they're family restaurants, they loved it, but they had the lowest starting salaries, highest level of debt, and we cut the program. We got a lot of grief for it, but it's like, I can't feel ethically good about a program that's doing that. So we do make changes based on that, but we're doing more and more with the, sort of trying to get big data to help us understand those questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all that energy. It's quite amazing what you can do with a pinched nerve. And so we're all super grateful for your incredible energy and focus. And all I can think listening to you talk, and I'm guessing some others too, is it that your model is just really different, or is it a harbinger of where all of us need to be going? And so I think that was just really powerful to hear you talk through it. And thank you so much for sharing with us today. And
thank you for having me. Really a pleasure to be with you all. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.